Thank you for inviting me to speak today at the unveiling of this amazing statue commemorating the Hong Kong people's fight for freedom. I want to congratulate the artist, Mr. Weiming Chen, for this powerful symbol of hope. It reminds us that despite numbing setbacks and bitter disappointments, the heroic struggle in Hong Kong is ongoing and linked to the Chinese people's courageous struggle for democracy and human rights. I want to thank Jin, Alice Law, and other sponsoring organizations for commissioning this sculpture. It's no coincidence that many others have a direct link to the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, including Zhou Fengshou, Feng Zhang, and Bob Fu. As we all know, many brave democracy activists lost their lives at Tiananmen Square or were hunted down and jailed or tortured. Others, however, came here to the United States to continue the struggle. For example, once he got to America, Bob Fu has been a tireless advocate, a champion, who not only testified several times at Chinese human rights hearings that I've chaired, but for decades has provided me and so many others in Congress with extraordinary insight, counsel, and well-crafted strategies for assisting victims while promoting reform. Thanks, Bob. Ladies and gentlemen, Tiananmen Square, like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet, underscore the brutal lengths the Chinese Communist Party will go to absolutely monopolize power. History will judge whether we stood with the people of Hong Kong and used every tool, including sanctions, to demand accountability of a Communist Party leadership that has broken its solemn promises and treaty obligations with impunity. History will judge whether we denounced and sanctioned Xi Jinping's genocide against Uyghur Muslims, never forgetting that he said he would show, quote, absolutely no mercy, and he hasn't. Women have been tortured, forcibly aborted, forcibly sterilized, and sexually assaulted. Entire families, as you know, have been put in concentration camps. Many have been slaughtered. History will judge whether we stood in solidarity with oppressed Christians, Muslims, Falun Gong practitioners, and Tibetans, and in recent years against synodization, Xi Jinping's policy of making all religious expression comport to communist thought or face serious consequences. History will judge whether we rigorously defended all Chinese women and their precious children from the Chinese Communist Party's cruel and violent coercive population control policy, which for over 40 years and to this very day relies on ruinous fines, forced abortion, and involuntary sterilization to compel compliance. History will judge whether we exposed and sought to end the pervasive use of torture, which has only gotten worse under Xi Jinping. In the end, history will require us to answer one very hard question. Did we stand with the tank man, or did we stand with the tank? As for me and so many others, colleagues both sides of the aisle here in Washington, we continue to stand with the people of Hong Kong and those in China fighting peacefully for human rights. And we will continue to shine a light on the repressive acts of the Chinese Communist Party. Shining a light on the Chinese Communist Party is what motivated me to first introduce the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act back in 2014, and then the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. Recently, with Jim McGovern, I also introduced the Hong Kong Protect Act, which restricts sales, as you know, to Hong Kong police, and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The Protect Act, as you know, has become law, and we continue to press for passage of the Forced Labor Prevention Act. Though these laws passed with large bipartisan majorities this year and last, it was a struggle to get the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act passed. When I first introduced it in 2014, in the midst of the umbrella movement, it was vehemently opposed. The State Department opposed the bill, as did many of our colleagues here in the House and Senate. The U.S. business community in Hong Kong, at the urging of Carrie Lam, also opposed the bill. They all said that the business of Hong Kong is business, and we shouldn't upset the status quo. But we all know the business of Hong Kong isn't business. The business of Hong Kong is freedom. And Xi Jinping was making, even then, in 2014, it abundantly clear that human rights and autonomy were at grave risk. So we passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act against opposition because all of you spoke up and fought for its passage. It did pass because of that groundswell with overwhelming numbers and margins because the protests of the Hong Kong people inspired the entire world. The resolve, courage, and tenacity and clarity of and purpose of the people of Hong Kong still shines through the darkness like the bright sun. As you know, the Trump administration has used the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and other laws to sanction Chinese and Hong Kong officials. The administration has taken many steps recently to address the export of the killer drug fentanyl, to bolster Taiwan, to protect online privacy of Americans, and to restrict Confucius Institutes on American campuses. It has used the Global Magnitsky Act, legislation which I first introduced in the House, to hold accountable officials complicit in torture and other egregious human rights abuses. All of these actions were taken because they are the right thing to do. They were taken because U.S.-China relations need a complete overhaul. So I do commend the Trump administration for jump-starting that important overhaul. My friends, we can no longer afford to separate human rights from our economic interests, which unfortunately President Clinton infamously did on May 26, 1994, when he delinked most favored nation status from human rights progress. It took all of us by surprise when he did it, but I think for many in China, they looked at us and said, we care more about profits than human rights, rather than having a principled position that human rights and profits go hand in hand. I believe the health of the U.S. economy and the environment, the safety of our food and drug supplies, the security of our investments and private information online, and the stability of the Pacific region will depend on China complying with international law, allowing the free flow of news, information, and developing an independent judiciary and civil society. That's the hope. That's the aspirations. And that's what all of us are fighting for. Human rights and the rule of law matter in U.S.-China relations. The U.S. and the international community cannot allow Beijing's domestic repression or its flaunting of international law and treaties to go unanswered. Unfortunately, none of these actions will ensure Hong Kong's autonomy in the short run. The passage of the authoritarian national security law is a dark cloud settling over that great city. It has obliterated Hong Kong's special status as Beijing moves quickly to solidify its control. I applaud the announcement of financial sanctions on Carrie Lam herself and other Chinese officials who undermined Hong Kong's autonomy. But more needs to be done. And I will continue to work with the administration and my colleagues on the Democrat and Republican side to sanction the Hong Kong elite who traded away the city's freedom. New sanctions should also target those Hong Kongers who serve as delegates to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and the National People's Congress. They voted for the national security law and should be held accountable for that egregious act. The administration should also use its authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to place secondary sanctions on key figures who are working to extend Beijing's control over Hong Kong, as well as any business institutions that act on Beijing's behalf. The U.S. has moved quickly to protect our interests and sanction Hong Kong and Chinese officials. We must move quickly to extend protections to the people themselves of Hong Kong. The national security law endangers millions of people who participated in last year's demonstrations. It also threatens democratic voices. We have already seen moves to arrest Jimmy Lai and Agnes Chow and others. We should join the UK and encourage other nations to offer a safe haven for those whom Beijing will persecute. I will be working with my colleagues to pass the bipartisan Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act. America should find ways to welcome Hong Kongers to the United States. It is a dark moment. Xi Jinping's government, as you know, continues to excel in crushing bodies and shattering bones. As a matter of fact, he actually said that would happen about a year ago if Hong Kong continued asking and demanding, frankly, for its democracy and freedom to be respected. We all know this current situation, as bad as it is, cannot last. We know this because the people of China, from Tiananmen to Hong Kong, will always seek freedom and human rights. Despite persecution, they continue and their numbers are growing. But we must all remember that the arc of history does not bend towards justice without the concerted action from all freedom-loving peoples. We cannot be silent. We must all remain engaged in the fight and be voices for the persecuted. Thank you very, very much.